The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, who has read the Wheel of Time over and over and over, and I am joined by Greg, who I realized today, if we were thinking about how much of the Wheel of Time you have read, you have gotten through T and half of the H. There are 14 letters in the phrase the Wheel of Time. Greg, how's it going?
You don't get to know that yet. Hey, I listened to the intro recently and just wanted to throw your own line back at you. So I'm good. Good to see you. Good to be back with our listeners. We're actually in real world. We recorded the last episode, not that long ago. So I love weeks like this where we've got a little bit of momentum and we're turning pages. So it's great.
Yeah, this was actually one of those weeks where my schedule conspired to have me reading relatively soon before we recorded this podcast. So I'm also feeling quite a bit of momentum in the sense that, I am right in this story that I just finished reading. Unless we have any last thoughts diving in, and I see you not having any strong opinions.
I already picked up my book. I'm ready to go, dude.
We should begin with an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, specifically looking at the rising sun of Cairhein, which is the chapter icon of chapter 25. And I want to let you, as usual, have the first kind of major thoughts about this icon, which just shows a rising sun on a field of black. But I will note this is the second of the chapter icons that we have that are pieces of heraldry, because we've also had the Lion of Andor in the previous book. So I'm curious if you kind of made that connection or if you had any other thoughts on this icon, either compared to the others or just on its own.
And here I thought it was just a spiky helmet of a man standing just below frame. I think when we talked about the lion, we talked about how it is heraldry, but it's also the icon features a broken frame. So it's not exactly what it could appear as on a banner, or there would be another square around it on a banner. So, it's really interesting. And I don't want to tip too much of our conversation of that chapter, but I don't feel like the Cairhein society represents like a blaze of light rising, right?
Yeah.
You could convince me it was a setting sun in some ways, but I still wouldn't give it that like pure white. And that's what stands out about this icon. We've talked before about the ones that are layered and the ones that are tipped towards the dark. And this is just so clearly meant to be bright, full white space over darkness that it's like, that's an interesting one to me, because it doesn't fit with kind of my image of that society from that initial chapter there.
Yeah, I actually had the thought that this felt like a flipped chapter icon to me, because I think if you're reading the Cairhein chapter, I think there's something to be said for it feeling like a kind of like vibrant, healthy society that is almost like rotten to the core, right? You can see the king seems to be the source of a lot of issues. This feels to me the opposite of what this icon does, right? The icon seems to suggest kind of like purity in the center of the city on, darkness outside. And if anything, it seems the opposite, with the foregate being the only kind of happy part of the city, which is the only part that's not in the city. So I think you're exactly right to be highlighting that this is a very, we've seen some of these icons that have some gray, or at least suggestions of gray. This is not that. It is all white and all black. And I think you're right to say that is, if anything, ironic for the society that we've just been introduced to, rather than directly applying to it. That was my big thought. So the fact that we're both echoing the same thing is probably a good sign for our reading, but maybe not a great sign for how much there is going on here. Is there anything else that jumps to your mind?
Well, two quick things. I mean, just in all the symbolism of a rising sun, usually that's a hopeful image. And
Yeah.
again, that just reinforces that this doesn't feel like a hopeful moment. I think there's a lot of trepidation I feel about Rand getting already kind of stepping in this society and kind of getting embroiled in all the machinations. And also just that Celine at the moment is the character who most represents this society. And we've talked about our dark feelings about her. So it doesn't feel hopeful or bright. Maybe trying to think of something. The one kind of direct resonance I see is we have the towers that keep getting added onto to just keep rising and rising. So,
Yeah.
maybe this is more how they think of themselves. And even though it's very apparent to us, even just meeting them, that that's faulty, that's what heraldry is. It's how you envision yourself. Our society is a majestic lion, even if it's past its prime or what have you. Imagine a society where the symbol's a soaring bald eagle through the skies, even though, yeah, we're kind of like a little chickadee in our behavior. I don't know.
That was really solid until chickadee was where we went with it.
Well, Ben Franklin wanted us to be turkeys, right?
That is
Let's go with
correct.
turkey.
Yes.
That's turkey. So, yeah, edit that in. But when your society is really a turkey. Beautiful. All right. Take it at that. I
Uh,
think we should dive in and get talking about these chapters.
I wholeheartedly agree. So we are going to begin this week with chapter 24, New Friends and Old Enemies, which begins with Egwene following and accepted through the White Tower. She is eventually shown to her room and basically is told that most of her days are going to be filled with chores as much as they are with learning. Once she arrives at her room, she is greeted by another one of the novices, Elaine, who we have met before. She is the daughter heir of Andor. She basically asks first about the two rivers and then about Rand specifically. They have a number of conversations about whether or not she has the spark to be able to channel on her own. And then Egwene starts kind of showing off summoning a ball of light. And then Elaine does the same. And at that moment, they each kind of see an aura around each other. And they both say it's the first time that they've been able to see that someone else was channeling. In this discussion, Elaine also warns Egwene about either going too fast or going beyond what the Aes Sedai tell her. And this is where we learn that it seems like novices are subject to corporal punishment in many cases, and it doesn't seem super fun. They also note that the Aes Sedai basically see them as children, and that is how they are treated until they are promoted to the next level up. At this point, they start discussing the fact that there are not enough novices in the White Tower. I think they say there are only 40 of them, and that's not nearly enough to keep the number of Aes Sedai being the same. At this point, they start walking through the hallways, and first they meet Logain, the false dragon who has been gentled and now seems to have lost all of the will to live. And then they eventually meet two other girls. So this is, oh, I'm sorry, just one other girl, Min, who again we have met before. They again talk about Rand. My note here is Rand is in trouble. And then they meet two young men who are shirtless for some reason. Robert Jordan is not always subtle. These are Galad and Gawain. Galad is kind of very into Egwene and not into anything else. And Min says that he will do what is right no matter who it hurts. It is clear that Gawain is also somewhat interested in Egwene. And then they run off because immediately who arrives but Elida, the scary Red Aja, also from Camelin. She basically dismisses the other two girls, although she does assign Elaine to get some punishment for not calling her Aes Sedai. And then she says she wants to talk to Min. So we then flash forward, Min after the conversation. The entirety of my notes is Min interrogated, Elida after Rand. Min will fall in love with Rand. And with that interesting hint at the end of the chapter, what was your thought on what I think is a moving the pieces around chapter that I probably could have summarized as just Egwene meets some people?
So I was really fixated on the title of this chapter and the kind of way in which it plays with expectations. So new friends and old enemies. But what felt really interesting about that is a literal description of Egwene, the point of view character's experience but
Yep.
it's the opposite of our experience. So as a reader, it was very much old friends and new enemies in some ways, right? I
Yeah.
think we had technically met Aleda before and we had seen Logain, but there was never any kind of contact with him.
Yeah.
And so it felt like, oh, actually engaging him, it felt like he's new to this story or new to our engagement with it. Um, but yeah, the rest of it just felt like, hey, remember all these people? We now
Yeah.
get to meet them through a new character. And it was very maybe the one other thing I'll say by way of preamble is just that it very much felt like we were experiencing the effects of Taviran,
Yeah.
that all of these mostly women, but also these two boys also know Rand, and they've been talking about Rand, and basically the whole world's been like, whoever Rand has touched has rippled into this story and gets pulled somewhere bigger. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's direct, as in Moraine recruiting Min, but other times it's like, oh, but I could never stop thinking about him and things like that. So I think those were my main understanding. Maybe the last is just that you had said, the Aes Sedai are kind of rotten to the core, and I think we got more kind of, or rotten at the core rather, right?
Yeah.
Like the organization is rotting from the inside a bit. I think we get some peeks at some of that. That's like, yeah, it's about power and the recruits and all that. It's like, oh yeah, this is not a healthy organization.
Yeah, and I think that as we're talking about kind of the Taviran nature in particular, to jump back one point, I think my favorite example of that we saw was the person who Matt and Rand rode on the back of his cart, and then he ended up staying in Camelin and fighting in the riots and became well known enough that Gawain is aware of him. And so
Yeah.
I thought that was like a really well done kind of example of that ripple. As far as the tower being rotten to its core, boy, does ending this chapter on Elida really kind of highlight that, right? I feel like you can see just how wrung out Min is, and that's a character who doesn't seem to get very flustered in the two interactions we've had with her so far. So I think both of those points are really well taken. To get us on kind of a chronological place, we learn at the beginning of this chapter a lot about the structure of the White Tower, right? This chapter kind of begins very much with Egwene learning over and over again just how difficult her time as a novice is going to be. And so I'm curious on your thoughts about this kind of positioning of the White Tower as being kind of very harsh in the way that it's training new people, because you could either see that as part of what you were describing earlier. This is an organization that seems to be flawed and seems to be kind of in some ways struggling with its own nature of having all these very powerful women seeking power. But at the same time, I think you could make the argument that this is necessary, right? Sheriam had made this argument, I think, in the previous chapter. If you're training people to have world shaking power, you need them to be able to follow orders and listen to guidelines and know that they, want this in the way that is really necessary for someone to devote themselves to it. And so I'm curious, in this early section, are you seeing this as an organization that's failing these people by putting them through this harsh of a training? Or do you just see this as kind of the good thing that they need to do, even if it may seem bad to the people going through it?
It's a really good question, and I was definitely thinking about it a lot in the context of that last chapter. But I will say primarily because it's like, oh, this is what Nynaeve got to skip,
Yeah.
right? That she gets to skip this kind of humbling of yourself and leveling of yourself, and I know this will make two consecutive episodes where I talk about the Star Wars prequels, but this is also like, that's the kind of thing about Anakin, is he was not raised in the temple and raised by the Jedi, and so he formed these attachments. He had unfinished business with his mom and then fell in love with the first girl he ever met and things like that. And so it feels like we're setting these characters up. It's like we saw the exception and now we're seeing the rule. And I
Yeah.
think both paths are flawed, but it's in the gap between those that is interesting to me. The last institution I worked at, there was a history professor who was absolutely awful to students, and not just like in the most strict, but mean paper comments. I would work in the writing center. I'd be like, this is harsh. I mean, I wouldn't
Yeah.
say that to them, but it's like about beyond the pale of what a professor should say, but making students feel belittled. And then, every time you talk to a student who ended up scraping out a C or a B in that class, all they could talk about after was how meaningful it was and how much
Ugh.
they learned and all this. And I guess, is that Stockholm syndrome that they
A little.
experience roughly? And so it's like, yeah, that is a philosophy. I don't think it's a popular one anymore, but there was a long time that kind of ruled academia, and it feels very much like here. It's like the cruelty is the point, and then they'll value the experience so much more than the cruelty. And I think, our generation of academics is much more in the empathy-based teaching. And
Yeah.
what if we just approach students with understanding and kindness and see how that, supports their learning, and yet they still get good outcomes, if you will. So this does feel like that's what we're kind of seeing here, is that
Yeah.
very old, like, let's just torture them and they'll appreciate it eventually. Whereas, I think because of my age my generation as an academic, I'm like, nope, let's just be kind to them.
Yeah, and I will say I think this probably says a lot about how Robert Jordan was brought up and the era
Mm,
that he was coming up in, right? Robert Jordan went to military school, followed by a military college, followed by boot camp, followed by years in Vietnam, right? I think this is
mm,
probably the way of teaching that he was experiencing at that era. And I think kind of tied up in this, we just have to acknowledge there's the corporal punishment thing. And let's be
mm.
real, those of you who have read the books, I'm not spoiling anything when I say this is not the last time people will be repeatedly spanked in the Wheel of Time. Robert Jordan just had some issues and they got worked out on the page sometimes, and that happens. That's all I
It
really
happens.
have to say about corporal punishment. But I need you to comment on it too.
Yeah, and I do think the light in which it's presented is not like, thank goodness they're doing this.
Right.
Last chapter it was like, this is the cost and it's a cost worth paying, whereas here I think the presentation is much more skeptical. And all that background I didn't know about Robert Jordan also makes sense with these kind of menial tasks, like she has to go wash dishes
Yeah.
because that is very much boot camp in those military institutions, even not as punishment, but just part of the education is to contribute in those tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this actually leads us kind of interestingly into the next section of the chapter where the characters are talking about the number of novices that there are. And they talk about how not only is it that there are very few novices who are being accepted, I think they said there are only 40 of them who are currently there, but then they say that only 8 or 9 of them will ever make it to the point that they will become Aes Sedai. So not only do we have this potential of the Aes Sedai, I think they talk about culling out the ability to channel, but I think there's also a question to be said for, do you hold these kind of extremely high standards when you're eliminating 80% of the people who could eventually contribute to your thing continuing to be powerful? So I see these two issues as potentially intertwined in an interesting way. What was your kind of first impression of this kind of new introduction of kind of a mystery slash plot slash whatever you want to call it of the White Tower shrinking over time?
Oh man, there's a dirty joke there that I won't touch. Because I shouldn't touch my white tower. I'm gonna be completely honest. My first reaction was I don't think I knew what culling the herd actually meant. I think I
Yeah.
only knew it in the metaphorical sense. So, I've used it a million times, I've read it a million times and always understood it, but that you literally breed out characteristics within the herd by killing off. I was like, oh, that makes complete sense, but I didn't really know that. So
Right.
so I liked it for that reason, and just an edification. But thinking a little bit more about the fact that they are wiping out the men, and again, I think the metaphor or the gesture asks you to think about it in purely biological terms, and
Yeah.
we haven't seen that this channeling is absolutely a hereditary characteristic or
Correct.
anything like that. But the idea that if whatever factors are leading some people to be born with this power, is it a X-Men mutation or something, and you just, whoever has it, you take away the males of the species, and then it would, I mean, now we're taxing my science and genetic knowledges, but if it's a recessive gene that
Yeah.
arises by chance once in a while, then taking away half the population is just going to lead more and more to fewer and fewer numbers. So I was surprised how shaky this was, and I didn't necessarily make that second leap you just narrated to the fact that, like, they've brought this on themselves or they shouldn't be so picky. I think hearing that from you now, it just reminds me that when they're talking about Rand and the seat and Moraine are kind of scheming, that might have a touch more desperation than
Yeah.
careful planning. If they don't have the numbers for an all out, we stand in two lines on a field and shoot stuff at each other fight, then they have to do kind of the Hail Mary type gesture to perhaps be successful still.
Yeah, and I think that this highlights something that we've been kind of talking about in a variety of different ways throughout the series, which is that it seems like so much has been lost in the current era. And some of that, it seems like, is even the power of the White Tower, right? Everyone still seems to be reacting to the Aes Sedai the same way they have before, but we're now maybe seeing there are some cracks in that kind of seemingly unbreakable edifice that have been built up over time. I think this is just the beginning of potentially starting to figure out what does this organization actually look like, because so far we've kind of only heard what it looks like from people on the outside or what Moraine has been telling us, and she may not be the most accurate narrator, even though we now know she can't actually lie about anything.
Well,
Unless you
and there's a reference there somewhere, I think it's in that section, about how all the great works of the Age of Legends were the men and women working together.
Yeah.
And so that too, combined with everything you just said, is a reminder like, well, we aren't going to get giant statues, right? We just saw one of those great works, and we've heard a lot about the architecture and the White Bridge and the tower and all these things. And then when we get to the next chapter, and it's like, yeah, there's shoddy craftsmanship going
Yeah.
on at these towers. It's all about that. I mean, I think the whole message is that this is a fallen society, right? This is
Yeah.
not where it once was, nor is it headed to get better or fix itself. It's headed the opposite way. So that is of interest to me as well. And, all in the context of us having now a male who can channel, and like, okay, is he going to usher in a legion of men who can wield the power, or is he going to do something great himself?
Well, and I find that to be a really interesting question to be asking, because the immediate next thing we read about is a man who tried to do exactly that, failed, and is now broken. Right?
Yeah.
What was your response to seeing Logain and just how far it seems like gentling has brought him down? This was the man who was staring down a queen like
Yeah.
400 pages ago. What was your take on how far gentling has leveled that individual?
It was so funny to me that he's just kind of lurking around the halls, like got nothing to do. Again, referencing my favorite movie of a couple years ago, The French Dispatch. There's a joke in French Dispatch, which is about a fake New Yorker like publication about a writer who's on the payroll, but he never seems to write anything, and he's just always in the hall in the background in scenes eating a sandwich or just chilling. And it's like, oh, that's what Logain's life has become. Like, there's action going on around him, but he's just having a sandwich, like flipping through a book in the corner. Like, and so certainly the juxtaposition, as you're saying, is what really matters. I think in some ways I was surprised he was still on the board, to steal your metaphor from before, that I just kind of assumed the process of gentling him would just kill him or be locked away forever and we'd never hear him again. And it seems to me that, if anything else, this chapter demonstrates that anybody Robert Jordan puts on the board, he plans to use. So I'm interested to see, could Logain just be here as a kind of warning of what could happen to Rand, both to Egwene and to us, or is he, a part of something bigger to come? I think I'm leaning towards the latter.
I think if there's anything that we can learn from Robert Jordan, it's that the answer to questions like that is always why not both? And I suspect that is often going to be the answer. I don't want to say too much more specifically about Logain, other than to just mention, I think that this chapter, you're exactly right to be identifying it as kind of putting a lot of boundaries on what Robert Jordan is trying to do with this story. And so I think having really small characters, right? This is also the first time Elsie Grinwell is mentioned again. If I hadn't said her name 6 times in a row, this would now be the moment where we'd be like, who's that? I know I've heard that name before. So I think Robert Jordan is kind of here starting to reveal a little bit. He's jumping between characters' heads more frequently in the second half of this book, and he's now tying in a lot of characters into different parts of the story than they were in before. And I think that is almost just him kind of setting the tone for where he's going. He's kind of signaling a shift just in terms of what the focus of the story is. It's a lot broader in the last couple chapters than it had been at any point previous to that. And I think the simplest example of this is that the next question I have for you is 4 names and then a question mark. Min,
Yeah.
Galad, Gawain, Elida. There's just a lot of people showing up in 3 pages. What did you make of the barrage of characters and their interactions with Egwene?
Well, and I'd throw Elaine into that mix just as the
Oh,
chapter as a
absolutely.
whole. Yeah, as bringing them all back around. My first reaction when she's like, "This is my roommate, Elaine." I'm like, "Elaine and Egwene? Seriously? This
Yeah.
is what we're doing right now?"
I will say
And
that
then
was not a rhyme in my head until the television show came out. So I blame Amazon.
I mean, they're having worked at colleges for a long time, you always hear like the random housing lottery happens to match up 2 kids from the same hometown,
Yep.
or like the 2 girls named Tabitha or something like that, and you're like, what? How does this happen? Can't somebody? And that was my first reaction, was like, really? And then when obviously the characters reveal very quickly, I'm like, oh, right, we've met Elaine before, and we should put this in the mix. I really didn't go too deep on any of them. It just felt like, oh, cool. Like I remembered those characters. I liked those characters. And the other credit I would give Robert Jordan is it didn't feel like showboating. Like, see, look what I did. It just felt more like, oh, it's actually really cool that when Egwene is feeling alone and missing Rand, she's running into person after person who asks immediately about Rand and all that. So there's a story reason to do it. Sometime over our winter hiatus, I think it was my brother-in-law told me that Robert Jordan had kind of envisioned this as a trilogy to begin with. Is that accurate? So
So
he was, yeah, go for it.
he had originally pitched the story to his wife, who was his editor, as a trilogy. And when she took it to, I forget if it was Doherty or Tor first, but when she took it to a publisher, they basically said, yes, we love it. We know he writes too long. Let's make it 6 books. And
Oh,
it
interesting.
kept growing from there. So my understanding is Jordan had originally pitched it as a trilogy, and then before he even started really writing the first book, had already had that idea kind of changed to a longer saga. But yes and no, I guess, is the answer to your
Yeah, well,
question.
and I imagine my brother-in-law told it to me accurately, but I kind of had it in my head that like, oh, like are these connections that are going to kind of bear out and like, it sounds like it's not the case in these, but so often with these fantasy series, there was like a point where they could have just stopped, right? Like, well, let's
Yeah.
build either the first book or the first 3 books to stand alone, and then if they're really popular, we can keep going. And so maybe it is the first 6 could be the out or
Yeah.
something like that, but sometimes when these first 2 books feel very close like that, it makes me wonder like, oh, okay, will a lot of this pay off in the third, and then we'll need to raise the stakes, or wherever that line is.
Yeah, I think that this series probably reminds me more of the way that George R. R. Martin has described his writing process, where he kind of originally had like a 3 or 4 book kind of outline. And then the way he described it is there was originally a time gap in that outline where he was going to jump forward and then have all of the characters kind of through flashbacks show where what happened to them in the
Mm.
previous years. And he eventually realized that flashback structure wouldn't work, and then realized he didn't have a plot for Daenerys for the like 5 years he had to fill in. And so he described himself as being tied in a Myronese knot, where he invented all of these plot lines in Marine for Dany to deal with. And then he suddenly was left with a dilemma where, well, why would she ever leave Marine when she has so many plot lines to deal with, right? So he
Yeah.
kind of created that dilemma for himself. I think Robert Jordan kind of did the same thing. It was
Mm.
he finished the second book and then had enough things to fill in that the gap between 2 and 3 became book 3. And then he
Mm.
wrote another book or two and had some more things to fill in. And you can almost see, like, I think I've mentioned before, one of the books in this series is takes place over, I think, 8 or 9 days. Like that feels
Yeah.
like the kind of thing that was originally meant to be part of another book and expanded organically during the writing process. I
Interesting.
suspect that same kind of thing happens here, where a lot of things that were intended to be book 5 ended up book 12, but it's not because the plot changed, it's just because more grew in the middle.
I see. Well, all of that kind of avoided your question. So let's just quickly run down Elsie Grimwald. Kind of cool that she's here. Doesn't seem important. We didn't actually meet her yet. Min, much more intriguing why she's here because she's not training to be an Aes Sedai, but her vision power seems to have been of enough note to Moraine that Moraine called her here
Yeah.
and wants her to be present to help.
Mhm.
The boys, just a couple horn dogs, just a couple shirtless horn dogs looking
Yeah.
for love.
Star too sexy for their shirts is my entire note on those characters.
And then perhaps the most intriguing I mean, Min is very intriguing to me. I don't want to undercut that. But then Eleda, who I think we knew before, I think we likened her to Worm Tongue, kind of controlling the queen or trying to control the queen. And it just feels like, okay, we're already nervous about Red Aja around Rand. And this one is acting particularly sketchy and scary. So, yeah, I don't want to keep us always saying who's sus each week, but that's what I felt.
I actually think we should just have a sus meter that we attach to each of these episodes. That should be a standing thing we do. I also don't have much else to say about these characters other than it's good to have a reintroduction to all of them. Two quick hits that I have. One is Min referring to Galad. I think she was prophesizing when she said he will never do anything, or she will always do what is right, even if it hurts someone. The way she said it, I think that is probably
I
true.
agree.
And then the other is at the very end of the chapter. I think we had kind of inferred that this might be the case, but Min outright states that she believes, likely due to her visions, that she is going to fall in love with Rand. So either of those two kind of new little bits of prophecy, any thoughts or anything jump out at you in them before we get into the next chapter?
The love thing was just very weird because it felt out of left field. And she essentially says it too. She's like, I barely met him. How can I do that? But yeah, it has that resonance with a prediction, a foreseeing. But it's
think
strange.
It was I think it was in the previous book that Min had said to Rand that Egwene is not for you, not in the way you want. So this is potentially like a tie-in to that specific prophecy.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. We have, it's funny how that is just a reminder, like, and remember, they're a bunch of teenagers, right? Like, we still just get those same hits. So, yeah, not much more to say about that. It did feel like it kind of came out of nowhere, but I understand what you're saying about that connection to that other line.
Cool. Well, in that case, why don't we get back into Rand's head? Oh no, that was a little sad. In chapter 25, Cairhein. So the chapter begins with Rand arriving along with all of the soldiers to a hill that they can oversee Cairhein. You mentioned before the topless towers. It's laid out in a precise grid, but outside
Wait, the topless towers, those are Galad and Gawain, right? I'm just trying to know. Oh,
that is correct. Yes.
Go on.
Yeah, between the topless towers and the white tower, we've got a lot of things going on in this episode. We might need to explicit tag it. So as they are making their way through the foregate, this kind of area that has grown up around the walls and the river, the soldiers are pushing their way through, but there are a large number of like jugglers and people telling stories and people with puppets. And they even note that an Illuminators Guild has set up in the area, and there will potentially be fireworks most nights. They then get into the city. They are told that they need to register and let the guards know what inn they are staying at. And then when they get to an inn, first off, the innkeeper assumes that Rand is an Aiel, but once they settle that, they get their rooms. And then immediately Hurin starts talking about Daes Daemar and how everyone is watching and plotting and paying attention. And when Rand eventually goes downstairs, there are multiple invitations for him, and he throws them in the fire immediately. And everyone seems to be concerned that if he keeps burning these letters copers, everyone will assume that he is actually deeper in the game than he actually is. Finally, Rand makes his way out to the foregate. He is seeing the shows and the puppets and enjoying himself. He has someone ask whether or not he wants to pay 2 coppers to see an Aes Sedai, which I just thought was funny, and so I had to mention it. And then he starts hearing someone telling the Great Hunt for the Horn, which makes him think of Tom, and that's not at all surprising because it is Tom. We are all obviously flabbergasted that Tom is alive. We never would have suspected it. And basically, Tom tells him no time to talk now, but come to the bunch of grapes and bring my stuff, and we can then get talking or whatever they're going to do. I was distracted by making a joke about the bunch of grapes. Greg, that's what I'm going to throw to you with.
Yeah. Oh, I thought I distracted you. I realized my shoe was untied, so I ducked down, and I realized only after the fact that it looked like I was hiding under the table while you were talking. So, yes, yeah, it was a very funny moment where in my notes I'm like, I paused and wrote like, he remembers Tom, haha, so not dead, and then it was like the next paragraph was Tom. I was like, oh, well, good job predicting that one, Greg. Nailed it for sure. A really interesting kind of this is kind of a familiar feeling chapter where we arrive somewhere new and kind of learn what this city, this culture is like. And
Yeah.
we've likened it before to that kind of D&D session, and it felt a lot like that. You arrive in town, you go to the inn, you think of blah blah blah. So it's not exactly thrilling, right? Those are never super exciting D&D sessions. You
Yeah.
rather, stab, push, push. But it was fun to read, and this is a new one. I think, a couple strands to pull out at first is it felt very interesting to me how bureaucratic
Yeah.
everything was kind of coming in, which seems to match the kind of Game of Thronesy vibe of the game, but
Yeah.
not exactly necessarily in some ways.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
we mentioned before, this is very much meant to evoke kind of like French medieval era as
yeah.
opposed to English, which I think fits exactly that kind of motif you're talking about. Sorry.
No, no, not at all. And then this my second one is just stupid, which is there was a joke in God, this is such a stupid reference in the movie Old School, where Vince Vaughn is complaining about his wife, and I think he's standing as one of the groomsmen at Will Ferrell's wedding, and he's like, "You got to run now, buddy. You got to run. Look at my wife, always watching, always judging. Just smile at her, always watching, always judging." And for whatever reason, I saw that movie when I was in college, and
Yeah.
my roommate and I went to we were at a school that was 96% women. And so whenever we were eating by ourselves in the cafeteria, we were always like, always watching, always judging, because we were on display, and not in any kind of sexual way, to be quite clear. We were incredibly nerdy and were basically not of interest, but the kind of gossip mills were always circulating around us,
Yeah.
and like always watching, always judging. So when we get to this inn, it's like that was the whole mood I had, was like always
Yeah.
watching, always judging. And I think the message is that Rand is so unequipped for this when he immediately turns down the invitations without a thought, and it's like, okay, so you just insulted 5 people or
Yeah.
whatever. So I think that's going to lead to interesting dynamics, even if they're not particularly interesting yet.
Yeah, and I think that kind of feeling of tension that we get for Rand when he is actually in the city proper is executed really well, but what I think is like a sandwich around those couple of scenes, right? The beginning of the chapter is set in the foregate and it seems really fun and enjoyable and Rand is into it. And then we get the scene at the gatehouse and then the inn is really tense. And then Rand gets back in the foregate and it's fun and exciting and Tom is there. And I think that that's deliberate by Robert Jordan, right? He's kind of making the actual feeling of Cairhein, the city, do exactly what you're describing. It evokes that feeling of being in a fishbowl and being overwhelmed and not knowing exactly what to do. And I think that only is effective because of how free and loose Rand feels in the early and late part of the chapter. It really highlights the difference from when he is kind of confronted by everyone assuming he's a noble and whatever is supposed to come along with that in Cairhein.
Yeah, well, so Thank you for that. I don't, in your summary, you mentioned kind of that, or no, it was in our discussion of the chapter icon. You mentioned kind of the four gate and the city, and I don't know that I'd necessarily picked out on those distinctions, but I totally agree now that you've illuminated that. It's like, yeah, the festivals and the frivolity outside, and then just total dread on the inside, as well.
Yeah.
You pointed out the Coppersford and Aes Sedai, and there are times where there's puppets of Trollocs, and it's like it's all very funny that it's like, oh, the telling of our story, and it's just so poorly done,
Yeah.
right? Almost like the Ewoks telling, or C3PO telling the Ewoks about the story of those characters, or I think Game of Thrones had some scenes where people were reenacting with puppets or
Yeah.
on stage things that we'd actually seen. And Shrek does that too, I think. Just all the great fantasy.
Among my
This-
among my favorite versions of this is in the Mass Effect trilogy, which now that you have a
Mm,
PlayStation, I am going to require that you go out and buy. It's
okay.
outstanding. But there is a DLC for the third game where you can get one of the characters drunk at a party, and they will throughout the night like mismash, destroy the story of Shepard saving the galaxy, and it's
Yeah.
absolutely wonderful.
Mhm.
I think you're exactly right to kind of highlight just how different things are here versus where we started the series, right? Because we've been
Mm,
traveling for a few weeks, a month, something like that. And in that time, we've gone from somewhere where you fight the Trollocs every weekend to a place where Rand says the person who made that puppet has never seen a Trolloc.
mm,
And I think that's a huge contrast to see for, we're halfway down the continent, but it's not that far, all things told, for people to have absolutely no idea what a Trolloc looks like. And I think that contrast is, I think, really telling.
mhm,
Also, in that same vein, I think there's something to be said about kind of the state of readiness, if you will. Right, we began this or we began this book in Shinar, which is a walled city where people were prepared to flee into the walls at any given moment. Contrast that against the Foregate, which is a part of a city that has grown out after a siege on the outside of the walls of the city. it
mm.
it just seems like there is something kind of off in terms of Cairhein and their reaction to the world around them. They seem kind of aloof and carefree. And I think part of the reason why is the kind of very bread and circuses attitude that the government seems to be taking, right? It is festivals every night to distract you from the bad things that are going on. Well, that doesn't just distract you from the internal bad things that are going on. It also might make you ignore things like Trollocs, or the fact that
Mhm.
your city is made of fire in a place that has been burned down recently. I'm sorry, made of wood in a place that has been burned down recently.
Yeah, so as you were talking, it reminded me that I hadn't looked at the map in a while. And so when I opened it, I was like, where are we actually? Because, like you said, halfway across the continent, I was kind of, and so my eyes actually went to the center of the map, kind of around the crease of the book, right? The spine of the book.
Yep.
And that's where I was expecting it. So I'm very surprised to see that we are kind of still far on the eastern side of this continent.
Yeah.
So, we have gone a little westward, but we've primarily traveled south
Yeah.
since this book began. And the fact that we're kind of near Camelin, we're kind of equidistance from Tar Valon and Camelin. I just would have expected we were headed back towards, like Two Rivers, who also hadn't seen Trollocs and were shocked when they arrived.
Yeah.
Um, so if anything, we're headed down towards like where Loyal is from, right? Stedding Shanghai is further east, but at the very southern point of this side of the continent.
Yeah.
And some of these other societies. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but yeah, I think
Well,
that I take your point that they're not ready, they're not fighting this actively. It's all myth and story and fun, not actual lived experience yet.
yeah, and if we look at the lived experience, I think that's exactly the same story. If we look at this chapter, there are a couple of notes on kind of the recent history of Carrion that I found interesting. One is that the Foregate area has been rebuilt since the Aiel War when it was destroyed. Second is that we hear about a large amount of grain being imported from Andor and Tyr, and the reason that's given for that is that none of the farms to the east of Carrion have been resettled since the Aiel War. So we know that the Aiel War took place approximately when Rand was born. So it's been 18 years without resettlement of what, if you look at the map, east of Cairhein is most of the country of Cairhein. So we
Yeah.
are looking at a pretty severe situation in terms of not producing food and being okay with the king just buying it with the hopefully endless coffers. So the economist in me is cringing this entire chapter, regardless of how fun the puppets sound.
I'm sure.
I don't have too much else to say about just like the culture of the Foregate, but I wanted to just get your last thoughts on any of this kind of recent history or just the distinction between kind of the in and out kind of fun and structured that we seem to see.
I don't have too much more to say about that, but I'll take it as a transition to note. And you mentioned one of two moments I had flagged in your summary, which is that the innkeeper, thinks that Rand is Aiel. But prior to that, just in case you'd lost track, there is, I think it's Loyal says, "Oh yeah, this happened about the time you were born.
Yeah.
That the Aiel took I keep
It's Cairn. The
Carrie-En.
yes, the
uh,
HEI is just an E sound for some
just an E.
reason.
Carrion, like, well, there you go, like carrion, like,
Yeah.
a rotting body. So I, it's still at the level where I'm like, I figured it out. But I think again, it's like Robert Jordan putting Clue 2023 on the board, and I'm like, I've found five of these.
I,
It just felt like a good reminder again, in case you'd forgotten from the last book. Rand is probably half Aiel from this conflict. So.
Yeah, and I think it is it's something that Robert Jordan does really well is he builds mysteries and then lets you find the last clue. And you might not have found all of the clues, but you feel really proud because you got the most important one. And
Yeah.
that's what I want out of a good mystery writer, right? That's why I love like Agatha Christie so much. I will pick up
Yeah.
any book I ever see of hers in a used section, and it's because I always have that moment at some point in the last 20, 30 pages of one of those stories. And I think for me, I think you're right to say that this Aiel heritage is something that is really getting hit on here. We see a lot of mentions of people kind of being really suspicious of Rand and his origins. And I think this all comes to a head for me when Hurin starts kind of explaining why everyone is questioning him the way that they are. And this gives us our kind of first really detailed description of Daes Daemar. What is your thought in the game of games, and on a scale of 9 to 10, how out of his depth is Rand?
27. Yeah, it's interesting because in the real world I am somebody who likes to follow politics. I like to follow polling and all that type of stuff, which is not an exact comp but is somewhat of a comp. Or my love of the Oscars might be that way, right? Like
Yeah.
who's popular, who's not type of thing. But I think because I'm experiencing so much of this through Rand, it's like, oh, I'm not really paying attention to the details of it because all I know is he's just a bumpkin in this regard and is just totally gonna mess up, and he does. And even after they kind of scold him, like, okay, so you just screwed up, he's like, yeah, whatever, I'll be fine. And I think it's very clear that like every minute he stays in the inner city is another minute his problems are getting worse there. And I can't help but anticipate that will eventually get him in front of the king in just deep, deep trouble. So,
And I think that this is something that Robert Jordan does a really good job of is giving us enough knowledge that the character doesn't have for us to kind of see what's coming for them. But at the same time, I find it completely believable that Rand ignores this advice about Daes Daemar, right?
mm.
I have been 18. I have been told that you should pay a little more attention to what other people think, and I have plowed through it. So
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
if anything, is another example of Robert Jordan being very good at writing, kind of inconsistent teens, which just means writing teens, I suppose. I may have said too much. Um, my next note is Tom, and then the chapter is done. This
Yeah.
it's a move the pieces around chapter. What were your thoughts on the final arrival of Tom on the scene?
Yeah, so same in my notes. It's like Tom's back, and then the only note I will say is he was acting a little funny, I thought. Like, they did do a kind of brief character catch up, but for the amount of time, I think we said at some point I was surprised how much Rand is like, oh, the old ache of missing Tom. And I'm like,
Yeah.
were they that close? And then they have the kind of brief, like, how'd you get out of there? And he's like, I was fine. And kind of yada yada some of those details. He's got a hurt leg, which he
Yep.
says is because the Fade injured him and then left because he wasn't interested in anything about Tom. And it's all kind of believable, but at the same time, I was like, he's just so like, nope, I can't talk to you now. I want my stuff. Let's meet up later so I can get my stuff. And my real pure kind of reaction was like, I don't know if I'd take that meeting, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like Facebook Marketplace. It's like, okay, but say you're going to meet out in front of the police station or something,
Right.
right? Like somewhere safe to do your transaction, not get lured to a secluded grove somewhere or something like that. And I think just to make what's implied obvious, like I didn't expect that. And so I'm not ready to put him in that pure he's up to absolutely no good, but I was very surprised by how he acted and think Rand should be not ignore him, not avoid him, but just take it a little slow with making sure this is his Tom and somebody he can trust still.
Yeah, and I think that this for me is really highlighted by how Tom initially reacts when he sees that Rand is alone, right? Because his reaction isn't, it doesn't seem like to say, are you still in trouble? What can I do to help? It almost immediately is like, there's no Aes Sedai with you, right? And so the fact that he is immediately keying in on the lack of Moraine almost as much, if not more, than just the fact that Rand is there, I think that is the thing for me that kind of set off that little bit of an alarm bell in the same way that it sounds like to you kind of brushing it off and being really brusque with it did the same thing. So I agree. There's maybe something to be said about like, do we know Tom as well as Rand thinks he does? But that's what I got here. There's not too much going on in terms of deep complexity that we can pick apart.
Well, let me just add to that thought. There is also so good call on the gesture about the Aes Sedai, and there's also a gesture there where he says something along the lines of, "Oh, if you're here by yourself, then it must have been one of the other two,
Yeah,
right?" And they were all kind of aware that it was one of the three, but it felt a little different when he said it that way. It was like, "Oh,
totally.
so it." I think what I'm saying is I would totally understand if this is him now being controlled and he was told to seek out the three boys and still help kind of figure out which one is which or something like that. Like none of
Yeah.
that would surprise me based on his behavior here. Although I will say kind of my heart is somewhere where I still want him to be pure or friendly in some way. So I'm excited to see more about that, but that's where I kind of landed this chapter.
I was about to go done, 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 but now I need to put a question mark at the end of it or something. You really threw off my joke. I don't know. You're gonna have to end the
Apologies.
section.
Well, and I think that is a good meaty discussion on two good chapters, and we're moving forward. I mean, what helps us undo a done 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 except to read more? So I think this was actually a slightly longer one for how they've been lately, and next week is back to closer to the more standard kind of 20-25 pages that we've been experiencing this book. So chapter 6 is called Discord, and it has a picture of a
26.
harp. 26, sorry.
There you
26
go.
is Discord with a picture of a harp on it. I was like, oh, come on, a pun right on there. And then chapter 27 is The Shadow in the Night, which is where we will continue both of these. I didn't read the first word, but knowing it's the harp icon, I assume we're continuing with Rand and Tom. And so I will pass it back to you to close us out.
Excellent. And we are, in fact, going back to Rand and Tom. So if you were wondering whether it's a dun 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 or a dun dun dun, you can find out next week. But we are also getting to the section of the book where I really start to think the pace picks up a little bit, right? We're no longer establishing. We've gotten the 18 new character introductions out of the way this week. And so stick around with us. It's time for this book to really get to the part that I think a lot of people really find is the beginning of them falling in love with this series. So hopefully you can fall in love with the Wheel of Time with us next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.